Hello everyone, it's Lindsay and it is another Tip Tuesday here on my channel, and today's video is in partnership with scrapbook.com. I reached out to them and we decided to come together for this video. They sponsored this video by sending me the newest set of Distress Oxide inks from Tim Holtz and Ranger, and so definitely go check out their website if you haven't. I always have links down below for them. They carry a wide range of products. They sent me some extra goodies to show you. And they've just been awesome to work with. So thank you to scrapbook.com for sending me the newest Distress Oxides and partnering with me for this video. And I'm going to be talking all about Distress inks and Distress Oxides. I get questions all the time about these, and I know in the Bible journaling world, a lot of people either love these, hate these, or not quite sure what to do with them. So I know a lot of you have been waiting for this video. So I get questions about the difference between Distress inks and Distress Oxide inks. There is a difference, and I will show you what that looks like. I get questions about bleed through, using on gesso, no gesso, different ways to use them. So this is going to be a longer video than normal, so grab a snack, get in your PJs, get comfy, and hold on tight. I'm going to try to cover as much as I can. And so what I have here is the newest, the third collection of the Distress Oxide inks. There are 12 different colors. There is a total of now 36 Distress Oxide colors. I do have the entire collection of these, and they are rolling out more this year. These colors match the colors of the traditional Distress inks, and so they will be recreating this palette of colors through the Distress Oxide inks, and I believe they're finishing out the collection this year. So if you're collecting these, don't worry, they're coming out. And so Distress Oxide inks currently only come in the large pad, and when you're shopping for these, you can tell the difference because Distress Oxide inks, of course, say oxide, but they are in a gray packaging, and regular Distress inks are in black packaging. So that's how you can kind of tell the difference. And then Distress inks come in small 1" by 1" cubes, and they also come in the full-size pads. Oxides will not be coming out in the small cubes anytime soon, just because of the formulation. They will only be in the large pads. But I have the smaller cubes for the regular Distress inks, and I keep them in one of these little acrylic makeup drawers that I found like at Marshall's or something like that, and that is how I keep my small cubes. They do also have the mini ink cube storage containers from Ranger and Tim Holtz, and you can put them in here. You can see I'm keeping my foam blending tools for my Distress Oxides in here. My watercolor paint palette that's in a tin like this, that is a tin that's meant to hold these 1" cubes. So however you want to store them, I just thought I could keep them all this way. I have all but just a handful of the small ink cubes. And so I like the small ink cubes because I can keep the mini ink blending tools down in the bottom of these, and so they just kind of nestle in there, and then you're good to go. I do have one sponge for each color. These sponges are washable, so if you just want to get a package and wash them and share them between colors, you can do that. I just didn't want to fuss with having to wash them, so I got one for each pad. Now for the large pads like this, you could attach a small piece of Velcro to the bottom, and then Velcro one of those foam blending tools on the bottom of there. That's probably what I will do. I just haven't done it quite yet. In the meantime, I'm keeping my Distress Oxide ones in here. It's super messy, not ideal, so I will be changing that method. You do not want to share color pads between oxides and regular Distress inks. So if you have one pad for each color, you do not want to use your Evergreen Bow Oxide blending sponge with the Distress ink, because this oxide is a blend of dye inks and pigment inks. I have an ink video. If you have questions about what that means, I'll link it down below where it talks about those differences. But this is a really special, unique blend of dye and pigment ink. Distress inks are a dye ink. And so if I was to use a blending tool with this and then go into one of my distress inks, I would contaminate my regular distress ink with a pigment ink, and you don't want to do that. So in the long run, it may mess up how your distress inks and distress oxide inks work. So you do want to have two separate sets of blending sponges if that's what you want to use. There's lots of different tools you can use with them. Scrapbook.com also sent me these little mini blending, what are they called? I think they're finger daubers, that's what they are. So they fit on the tip of your finger, and so you can pick up ink and you could go through a stencil or, you know, make little circle dots on your page or blend around the edge. So this just gets into a smaller area than you can with the blending sponges that I have. So you do have that option, which is great for Bible journaling because it is smaller scale. So you've got that. Let's jump in and talk about the different colors and what you can do with them, and just kind of jump right into the differences. Okay, so here is a swatch sheet of the 12 new colors. And what I've done is these top swatches are Distress Oxide inks. The swatches going this direction are regular Distress inks in the same color. So this is Tattered Rose, this is Squeezed Lemonade, Shaded Lilac, Bundled Sage, Evergreen Bough, Forest Moss, Blueprint Sketch, Mermaid Lagoon, Carved Pumpkin, Aged Mahogany, Gathered Twigs, and Hickory Smoke. And so you can see the Distress Oxides and Distress inks, when they are the same color name, they're the same color. What you will notice though is Distress Oxides have this very interesting kind of chalky finish. So this is Aged Mahogany. This is the one that's easiest to tell the difference. And you can see the regular Distress ink is very rich and deep and looks like dye. Distress Oxides kind of have this aged chalky oxide look, kind of a velvety look to it. When I rub my finger on there, it does not come off. It feels chalky compared to regular distress inks, but that doesn't rub off on your finger. And so as you know, kind of look as far as the differences go there, that's kind of the look difference. Now they behave differently. So I'll kind of show you real quick what that looks like, and then I'll show you some examples in my Bible where I've used different Distress Oxides and Distress inks. So I'm just taking some clean water on a brush, and I'm just going to dab some water on here just on one side so you can see what happens with the different oxides and regular ink. Oxides are very unique in how they behave. They are awesome. I'm just going to do a few of these so you can kind of see what happens here. Okay, so both inks are meant to react with water. There's a lot of inks that will react with water, but Ranger Distress products are intended to react with water. So they are formulated so that they just do some really unique things. And you can really see it with this Gathered Twigs, the kind of the difference. So the Distress Oxide, when it reacts with water, it oxidizes. So it gets this kind of velvety finish on the top and really changes the color. There's some colors that really pull out completely different colors. You can see there's a lot more of this limeish green. That's the dye part of the Distress Oxide ink that's coming out. And then it will have this kind of oxidized effect. With the Gathered Twigs, you can see just how different they are between the oxide and the distress ink, and you can see those yellow tones kind of pulling out as opposed to what happens with, you know, the regular distress ink. So when you're trying to decide which one to get, they're just different in what they do. They behave pretty similarly in your Bible pages as far as bleed through and that kind of thing. So they all bleed through. They all have dye ink. Dye ink, anything that says it has dye ink is gonna bleed in your Bible. So I know a lot of people are hesitant to use these in their Bible pages because of the bleed through, but I'm gonna show you what that looks like and some ways to deal with that. But Distress Oxides just have this really neat effect that happens when they react with water. They get this kind of aged, oxidized look, and then you can see just how blendable the distress, either one, but the distress inks become when they react with water. So let me show you some examples in my Bible so you can kind of see how I've used them and what that looks like. Okay, so any pages in my Bibles where I have process videos, I will link those down below, as well as the products used, so definitely check that out. There will be plenty of information down in the description box down below the video. This page here I have a process video for, and I actually use some regular Distress ink. This is my older Bible, so everything in here will be regular Distress ink because Distress Oxides weren't out yet when I was working in this Bible. So just regular Distress ink that I mixed in with some white texture paste to tint it this purple color and then put it through a stencil. So because it is a water reactive medium, like gelatos, like watercolor pencils, like Neocolor 2 crayons, it can mix in with products like clear gesso, matte gel medium, texture paste, anything that's got a wet medium to it, a wet feeling to it, will mix with Distress inks and Distress Oxide inks to tint it and create a custom color. So I went ahead and just colored that. This one here, if you are worried about bleed through, because Distress inks do bleed through, let me show you real quick. When mixed with the texture paste, it didn't bleed through. So this is an unprepped page. When it was mixed with that texture paste, it didn't bleed through. But if you were to just directly stamp or something like that, watercolor with it, it will bleed through. If you don't want bleed through, you can work on something like the Distress watercolor cardstock or regular cardstock, but Distress watercolor cardstock is meant to work with Distress products, and so they just blend beautifully on here, and they just play nice on here. Here is an example where I blended some Distress Oxide inks, or I'm sorry, this is Distress Oxide inks and this is regular Distress inks, and they just blend so beautifully on this cardstock because that's what it's intended for. And so what I did was I took some of this and blended, I think this is picked raspberry and cracked pistachio, maybe evergreen bough. I can't remember. I have a video for this page. Blended it on some cardstock and then die cut this with some alphabet dies. And so I could adhere them to the page and not worry about bleed through. This is one thing, you'll see the texture in those letters, those little water droplets. That's what happens when you spray this with water and then just use a dry paper towel to pick it up. And it kind of has this bleaching effect because it reacts with water. And so you get this really fun texture. That's why I love working with Distress products. I just love the fun textures you can get, how they blend together. They're just gorgeous in that aspect. This one here, I believe there's a process video for. This is just a piece of cardstock that I dry embossed. So I used an embossing folder and ran it through my die cutting machine. And then I used one of the blending foams and a blending tool. Let me show you how that works. So with these blending foams, I should have mentioned this, they attach to one of these wooden pieces with Velcro, and so then you can go in and blend. I've also shown in videos where I use these to apply gesso for page prep. They just make for a really smooth page prep, but then you can just pull it off and switch it out. So I had just used one of those blending foams and just lightly dusted color over the embossing, and so it just colored the raised portion of those circles, and so then I had this kind of tone on tone effect there. This one here is using Distress inks directly on the page with one of those blending tools and lightly blending the color on the page. This is a naked page, there's no page prep. And you'll see there is shadowing like where the stickers are, but no bleed through. If I was to go in and add multiple layers of color on here, eventually that color is gonna seep through the page. So if you keep it light, you're fine, it won't bleed through. Now if I was to get this wet, or if I was to come back in and get this side of the page wet, it is gonna activate that color and that color is gonna come through the page. So just keep that in mind when you go to work on the back side of the page. I'll wanna either work with dry Distress inks or dry products on this side of the page so it doesn't reactivate through there. This is an example of working on clear gesso. So this page was prepped with clear gesso. I have a video for this page. I've had some questions from people saying, my Distress inks aren't drying on gesso. Now they take a way longer time to dry on top of a prepped page just because they're not able to sink into the page. And so you'll notice the color is very light. I can't ever really intensify the color any more than this because it's not able to sink into the fibers of the paper. It's just sitting on top of the gesso. One nice thing about having a page prepped is that it blends beautifully. You're not going to get streaking. I have some streaking just where my application of gesso wasn't very smooth, and so you can see it's grabbing onto areas where the gesso wasn't applied. But for the most part, because it's sitting on that surface, I can blend it and get this really smooth, seamless blend. Down here, what I did is I actually watercolored with distress inks, and I'll show you that in a minute. You can use them like watercolors and went in. Because this page was prepped, nothing bled through. But you do want to dry it with a heat tool, and I even let this lay open for about 24 hours just to make sure that it was fully dry. And then I took a dry paper towel, laid it over the top of this, and kind of patted it to pick up any extra ink that might be sitting on top of the page. And then now it's dry, nothing rubs off the page now. But I can't get it any darker than this. This is all the color that it will take and still be able to dry. So you can work on top of gesso, it's just a little bit finicky. Here is a page where it was not prepped with gesso. I did the ink smooshing technique where I smush out some ink onto a piece of plastic, squirt it with some water, and then mush it down onto the page. I do believe there is a process video for this. So it is wet. And you can see the bleed through wasn't terrible. Some colors just bleed through more than others. I can't tell you which, because sometimes I think lighter colors aren't gonna bleed through, and they do. Sometimes I think darker colors are going to bleed through and they don't. So it's kind of, you just are gonna wanna test things in the back of your Bible. So this was Abandoned Coral and Spun Sugar. Abandoned Coral, you can see, is a very vibrant pink, and it did not bleed through. There's shadowing, but didn't bleed through. So, you know, sometimes it's just kind of a surprise, and that's another reason why I like them. They're fun in that aspect. Here's another way to use them and not worry about bleed through. They're distress inks. They are made to look distressed, make things look distressed. So you can use one of those sponges, or just take the pad directly to the edge of some cardstock. I took some black soot distress ink and just kind of brushed it on the edges of things to make them stand out and pop out. So this doily, you can see, kind of stands out more because it's got that distressed look around the edges. So that's one way to use them. Here, this page is prepped with gesso. And I did that because I knew I was going to be working with them wet. So I had a stamp. I inked it up with the ink, and then I used a spray bottle and just sprayed the stamp with water and then stamped it down. And because they react with water, you get this watercolor effect. And the colors, I only used yellow and blue, but where they blend together, I get these greens and teals and things. So that is one way to use them. Because I was using it with water, I did use gesso, and so there's no bleed through. And I just made sure to really dry this well with my heat tool, and then pat it with a dry paper towel to pick up any extra ink that might be sitting on the surface. But that is a really fun way to use them and get that watercolor effect if you're not comfortable with using watercolors. Okay, my current Bible that I'm working in has Distress Oxides in it, because by then Distress Oxide inks had come out. So this page here, I don't know if there's I don't think there's a process video for this one. There might be. There's no gesso. It is a naked page. I blended multiple colors of Distress Oxide inks in this kind of rainbow. And anywhere where they blend together, you get new colors. So I just used blue and yellow, and I got this green. Yellow and this pink, and I got this orange in the middle. So they blend beautifully and create colors. They're just awesome how they blend like that. Distress Oxide inks blend more smooth than regular distress inks because they have that pigment property to them. It kind of stays wet longer, sits on top of the page, and so you have some more time to blend out harsh lines. And that's one thing when you're blending, you have to be careful, because if I was to ink this up with the blending tool, ink it up, and go right in, sometimes you'll get a mark right where you put down your blending tool. So you want to kind of work from off the page. Use a light hand, especially in your Bible page, because they're just not nice with distress inks, like using a distress cardstock is. So you can see it's a naked page, it wasn't prepped, and there was no bleed through, and you can see there's quite a bit of color. And I did actually spray with a distress sprayer and picked up some color to try to get that bleached out effect. So even with that little bit of water, it didn't really bleed through. So like I said, sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. It's kind of a surprise. I know that's gonna scare some of you, but I don't let it bother me. I just have fun while I'm working with this page, and I don't worry about what's happening to the back page. I can deal with it later. And there is a process video for this page. This one's probably using regular distress inks. And I did a tone on tone, so I used a gray distress ink and lightly blended it onto the page. And then I stamped with that same color of gray. So you got this tone on tone stamping. This doily here was white, and I went in with Chip Sapphire distress ink and I think a little bit of black soot and inked it up to get a custom color. And then on the back side here, you can see that gray ink was starting to bleed through because I was stamping with it. So when you're stamping with distress inks, they 100% do bleed through. This page here was using Distress Oxide inks like watercolor. I do have a process video for this page. And you can see the watercolor didn't bleed through, but where I stamped the stars did bleed through. So I was a little bit surprised that the watercolor part didn't bleed through. And you can see Distress Oxides just have this really pretty kind of velvety, frosty look to it. I don't know, it just has this really unique look. I love it. All right, like I said, long video, lots of examples so you guys can see. This was a piece of cardstock that I just blended, added some water. Again, another way to use it and not worry about bleed through because you're working on a separate piece of paper. This one here, I do have a process video. This was using Distress Oxide inks, these letters on photo paper. So definitely check out that tutorial. They are so awesome when you use them on photo paper. They have this like fuzzy, velvety texture on top, and then once you buff that off, you get this really just bright, vibrant color underneath. It is so fun. Definitely check that out. I will link it down below. Here's using distress inks to distress the page. So just blending some distress ink around the edge to give it that weathered, worn look. That's kind of a common way to use them. Here I used distress inks through a stencil really lightly, not page prepped, and you can see shadowing but no bleed through. Here is an example of terrible bleed through. So I wanted to pull out the colors of this butterfly, and I had just gotten some of the new Distress Oxide inks and was playing with them and thought, oh, I'll stamp because the colors match perfectly with the watercolors I used. So I stamped some triangle stamps onto the page. I watercolored in the butterflies, an unprepped page, and I had full on bleed through like crazy. So what I will do is I will go over this with some white acrylic paint really quick, really light, and hit it with a heat tool really fast so it doesn't get super, super wet. And I think it'll be fine. It won't activate this. So you just have to work minimal moisture really quick, and I should be able to cover this just fine. But here's where you can see that Distress Oxide. So you can see on this side, it's just a different color than this vibrant green. So this is the dye portion of the Distress Oxides, and this is the pigment portion that you're seeing. So this is a really unique way to see just the layers of color that's in those inks. The Distress Oxides specifically are just really awesome. And you can see the Distress Oxide watercolor did come through a little bit. So just, you know, use at your own caution. So let me show you some other examples of using on gesso versus not gesso and some real quick techniques for you. All right, so I told y'all it's gonna be a long video. I have a lot of different techniques to show you too. What I have here is some just mixed media paper, which I've used in my other Tip Tuesday videos. And I have some clear gesso from Art Basics, this one here. You can find it at Michael's. I used a paintbrush to just roughly apply some up here, and then this is naked, there's nothing on it. And so what I did was I blended some of the Mermaid Lagoon Distress Oxide ink over gesso and non-gesso, so you can kind of see what happens there. And then I stamped over gesso and non-gesso so you can see what happens there. And so I have one of the blending sponges on there on the tool, and then you're just gonna pick up some color and blend it on there. And what I want you to see is that this side is going to continue to get darker and darker. This side has already taken as much color as it will take. What's happening now is the sponge is just kind of moving the ink around that's already on there. It will not get darker than that and be able to dry. It'll just kind of sit up there. So that's kind of the downside to using gesso, is you can't really get it to the deep, deep intensity that other side is. But it does stay true, you know, to the color. You just can't get it super, super dark. When you are blending, One thing I like to work on is a non-stick craft sheet. If you're blending onto cardstock or something like that, you want to kind of start from off the edge and then blend onto your paper, and that's how you get a nice, smooth, soft blend. If I was to ink this up and go right into the page and ink, you can see I get this dot that's really, really hard to blend out. It is easier to blend out with the Distress Oxide inks than it is with regular Distress inks, and I am kind of on the gesso part of it, and so it's probably gonna blend a lot better. But you can see here, on a naked page, and it's even worse on your Bible page, it will look like you just stamped your dauber down and you can never really blend that out. So you do kind of want to work with a light hand on your Bible pages, barely touching, skimming the page, and that's how I'm able to get a better blend. Ideally, like I said, you're working on that distressed watercolor cardstock, you'll get a softer blend than on your Bible pages, but you can achieve it. Especially if you're working on gesso, you can really blend it out and get it smooth, but you just can't get it dark. Let's see. For stamping, you can see it kind of, because it sits on top of that gesso, it kind of blended together and you had a more clear stamping, but it's going to stay wet longer, so I hit that with my heat tool. Stamping seems to be okay, you know, and it wouldn't bleed through on the gesso side with stamping. Distress Oxides stamp better than regular Distress inks. Let me pull out a regular Distress ink and you can kind of see the difference. Distress inks have a distressed look when you stamp with them. So let me grab a Mermaid Lagoon Distress ink. Okay, so I have a stamp here. Now when stamping with Distress inks or Distress Oxides, you want to kind of dirty up your stamp so that it doesn't bead up quite as much. Just the nature of these inks, you're not going to get a super solid, smooth stamping with them. So let's go ahead. This is regular Distress ink and this is Distress Oxide ink. And you can just see it's just a little more patchy, a little more distressed look than the Distress Oxides. And so that's one perk to using Distress Oxides. Distress Oxides also, because they have that pigment property, you can stamp on darker cardstocks like blacks and grays, and the color is going to show up where it won't on with regular Distress inks because they're just a dye ink. You can play with smooshing, and that's one thing I really love to do. So let's take a couple colors here. I have Squeezed Lemonade in the Distress Oxide. I have Tattered Rose. These are two of the new colors. So I'm just smushing it onto my non-stick craft mat. You can get the Ranger one. I just find some inexpensive ones on Amazon. Ranger just came out with this new glass mat that you can blend and play with, and it is super awesome. I definitely want to get that. I'll link that down below if you want to check it out. So I just went ahead and just sprayed a few sprays of water into that, and you can see it starting to bead up. And then I can turn my paper over and kind of dip my paper into the ink, and you'll get this fun, this is a huge piece of paper to be doing this with, but watercolor mushed effect, and they'll blend together. You'll get some oranges. If I hit this with my heat tool, go into it again, you can start building up different layers of color. I'm just gonna wipe that off because I'm gonna get it all over the place if I'm not careful. And that is one fun thing that you can do with them, and experiment with different color combinations, multiple colors. If you check out that video where I did the mixed media alphas, that I did a similar technique on there, and you can see that. Another way is ink smooshing. So taking a piece of plastic and adding color onto the plastic. You can do multiple colors and spraying it with some water. So it's basically the same technique, you just have a little more control because you can see what you're doing, and then smush it down. Especially with a Bible page, you can't really turn your Bible over and mush it onto a mat like that. This is how I do it in my Bible, is with a piece of plastic packaging. So there's that. You can use it like watercolor, so if you are working on a mat, or you could work on an acrylic block. Let me find a bigger one here. So I have an acrylic block. You can use Distress Oxides or regular Distress inks. I mush it out onto there and then just take a wet paintbrush and pick up some of that color, and it turns into watercolor that you can paint in images with and things like that. And you can see in my Bible, sometimes it bleeds through, sometimes it doesn't. You can work on gesso with this technique if you want. Let's see, you know, doing the blending different colors together and adding water, you can do that on your Bible page or a separate piece of paper. So there's lots of different ways. Check out, you know, Google Distress inks or Distress Oxide inks. Tim Holtz has several videos with scrapbook.com that you can check out. I will link those down below, where he shows different ways to use the Distress Oxide inks more in depth than I could possibly cover on here. So check that out and just kind of play and explore. They are kind of different for using in your Bible, but I love it. I think they are fun. You can go in through a stencil, try using the Fantastics. These are a foam like blending tool, and so you can dip this into the ink and then color in areas. I have videos showing how I did that. I have an entire playlist on my channel titled Distress Inks, showing all the videos I've done using Distress Inks and Distress Oxide inks, so check that out. If you have questions about them, leave them down below. I would encourage you to watch some of the other videos. Some of your questions might be answered in those videos, so check those out. Give this video a thumbs up if it was helpful. Subscribe to my channel if you're not already subscribed. And until next time, thank you so much. Bye-bye.